So what does the nanny state, overregulation, helicopter parenting, dependence on technology, and poor people surviving full-blown societal collapse all have in common? Well, they're all things I talk about in today's video, so let's get to it. People who grow up in bad neighborhoods need to be more adaptable. Take, for instance, one of the worst neighborhoods you could imagine in a city, say like Detroit. There won't be a big difference between that neighborhood before and after SHTF. Unlike the sharp contrast that will be well-to-do suburban gated communities pre and post-collapse, most of these environments are, in many cases, already without rule of law, because it's going to take the police hours, if they ever even get there, to respond to calls. So for this reason, people who live in these environments, they have to be more adaptable. They have to have a more MacGyver mindset, because you have to do more with less. And I'm in no way, shape, or form trying to glorify the life of poverty. And I think a person should do whatever they can to escape a life of poverty. And I'm also not saying that all poor people are created equal. There's poor people who work hard to get out of poverty, and there's those who don't. Most people who grow up in poverty have a healthy sense of insecurity. They're always kind of in survival mode. Those survival skills remain vital. They're not fully domesticated like their suburban counterparts. The funny thing is that most people who live deep in the inner cities actually have more in common with people who live in the rural environments than they think, because both of their survival instincts are still very vital. When you live in a rural community, chances are you have a better understanding of where your food comes from, of where your water comes from. You have a better connection with the critical infrastructure that sustains you. You're not shielded and complacent like your counterparts in the suburbs. There's a degree of individual responsibility and discretion that's required to live that sort of lifestyle. What they've retained, which requires individual responsibility, is vigilance. Where they may not know how to hunt or to grow food or to dig a well, they have street smarts. And these two character traits from these two different worlds complement each other very well. Because the people in the suburbs and the well-to-do people in the uptown high-rises have neither of these. In the case of people in the inner city, although there's less self-reliance, because they don't have the luxury of having grown up in a safe environment where they don't have to lock their doors at night, their fight or flight response is very well practiced. Whereas there's many people who've lived the lap of luxury their entire life who've never been in a crisis before. For them, a trauma is what some people call Saturday. Now, not all people are going to respond this way. Some people have sustained such traumatic experiences that they develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And they actually become more debilitated in times of crisis than people who've never been exposed to such events. But generally speaking, people who've been through the meat grinder usually have better coping strategies for acutely stressful situations. In the case of all-out societal collapse, if you have grown up in a padded safety bubble your entire life, and that is suddenly stripped out from underneath you, you're going to have a lot of problems adapting to that world. If you've never experienced hard times, it's going to be very difficult for you to process and accept that. For me, for instance, I know full well what hard times are. I grew up in a very impoverished environment. And if hard times ever fell on me again, it's almost as if I already have the software to process that experience. So when things get really bad, my brain goes into crisis mode and it's like, okay, here we go again. Some people don't have the software for that. So when things get bad, all of a sudden, they're forced to learn how to code. If you never experienced hardship, there's a good chance that you're going to be overwhelmed by it. So my message to poor people is, number one, try to get your ass out of poverty while you can. But number two is, don't underestimate the power of your experience. Don't envy those who have all the trinkets, because your experience in poverty is a form of wealth when it comes to emergency preparedness. I've worked alongside people who've come from war-torn countries, And I can tell you that in times of crisis, there is no person I would rather have by my side than these individuals. Because for many of these people, when the shit hits the fan, because they've already had these experiences, it's nothing new to them. It's not a shock to their system. Now, I also want to talk about the culture of safety and the whitewashed, over-sanitized, overly protective nanny state society that we live in. Now, when I'm talking about the overly safe society, I'm talking about over-regulation. I'm talking about exaggerated occupational health and safety. Yes, these safety standards over the last 100 years have drastically improved the quality of life. This has led to less accidents, less casualties, both on and off the job. However, creating a safe environment is a double-edged sword, especially when it comes to emergency preparedness. Anytime you make an environment safer, you in turn reduce individual responsibility. Now, the utopian view of overregulation is that it's a good thing because it frees up more time for us to think about other things so that we can ponder the mysteries of the universe and do fine arts all day. Well, we all know that that's not true. You just end up working twice the amount of hours for half the pay because the cost of living in these densely populated urban environments keeps skyrocketing. But take, for example, how we're all going to be enticed into self-driving cars. Less responsibility. It's just one more skill you don't have to have, which will free up more of your cranial bandwidth so you can play more video games and have more storage space in your brain for goofy cultural memes. At least that's what we're told. Somebody who was arguing against what I was saying would say that this is a good thing because it's going to enable us to reach higher points of knowledge that we wouldn't be able to reach when we're so preoccupied with these monotonous tasks that we're burdened with doing, like driving. And that may well be the case while the grid is fully functional, but in times of disaster, in times of crisis, we may need those skills. We may need to know how to drive a vehicle. We take it for granted how easy it is to do that. But remember how you felt the first time you tried to drive a car. How foreign of an experience it was. This is just one example of the many ways in which technology and safety are leading to the atrophy of certain skills and abilities, while indeed paving the road for others. But every time we regulate a process to make it safer, a certain ability within us atrophies or dies. Kids' playgrounds are a great example of this nowadays. Most playgrounds now have the padded rubber. They're exceptionally safe. In fact, they're so safe that most kids don't like them because there's no element of risk. This is why risky playgrounds are actually making a comeback, because they find that kids who play in these unsafe playgrounds develop better cognitively because they have to take risks. They have to learn how to navigate a precarious environment so that when they're older and they have to go out into the real world, which is not going to be a padded environment with safety nets everywhere, there's going to be times when you touch the fire and you get burned. This allows kids to take responsibility for their physical bodies in space and time, and that translates into how they begin to view the world. They then approach life with an appropriate degree of apprehension and confidence. In the absence of this, that tends to be lopsided. Either kids are too confident or too apprehensive. And this is one of the problems of helicopter parenting, and as a parent I understand this full well, that there's a paradox to keeping your children safe in that you ultimately make them less safe, because if they don't make those mistakes at a young age when there isn't much at stake, they may ultimately make the mistakes when there is more at stake later on in life. If we wall our children in, if we wall ourselves in for that matter, and become overly domesticated with all this regulation and fencing, we concede the ability then to learn certain things through trial and error, because it minimizes our ability to explore and to experiment. If there is no risk, if there is no uncertainty, this can't stimulate creative thinking, problem-solving capability. Wouldn't it be amusing if by the time we invented artificial intelligence which could problem solve on its own, that we had made a world which had basically neutered our own ability to do so? We are certainly on track to make that a reality. Problem solving is a core pillar of intelligence. If your children don't have to problem solve, their analytical capabilities become stunted. The downside of all of this is that if the shit ever were to hit the fan, there would be billions of people who have been indoctrinated into this culture of technological complacency. A safe society means that you're never able to hone your skills and test defenses. Imagine your immune system, for example. If you've never been exposed to any germs in your life and you lived in a bubble your entire life where everything was safe and you never had to worry about any pathogens, if you ever were to step outside that bubble, you would get incredibly sick and probably die. It's important that over time you gradually build up antibodies and you expose yourself to these pathogens so that you can develop your immune system. So it's important that we get out there, that we get sick, that we get dirty, that we get our hands dirty, that we experiment a little bit, that we maybe, stub our toes and break a fingernail every now and again. Because it's these experiences which create good survivalists. One of the things that irritates me the most is people who are overly aggressive about safety simply because it's a law. Now again, I'm not saying that safety is a bad thing, but we need to acknowledge that there may be drawbacks, especially when we take our protectiveness to the extreme. For example, I wanted to put my son into Boy Scouts recently, and to my surprise, the majority of the time they spend in Boy Scouts nowadays, at least where I am, is doing fundraisers, playing Frisbee in the park, and playing board games. I had it in my mind that Boy Scouts were supposed to go out and learn survival skills, but apparently that's not the case anymore. Now, perhaps I was a bit naive and ignorant to some of the changes to that program over the years. So I just decided, well, we're just going to put him in a martial art and I'm going to take him out and teach him survival skills myself. But I wanted it for the social component also, but I also wanted him to be learning those skills. But when I learned that now they don't even let kids run in campsites due to fear of legal recourse, what have we become as a society when we're not willing to even let our kids run in a campsite, for God's sakes, out of fear that they're going to trip and fall? Well, maybe it's good that they trip and fall. Maybe it's a vital lesson that they need to learn now so they don't make the same mistake down the road when there's more at stake to lose. Every time you do something that's safe, even with a lot of the approaches to training nowadays, take for instance exercise machines. They're excellent for rehabilitative work. They're excellent for people who are maybe well past their prime and are just trying to maintain some modest amount of muscle mass. But in terms of the capabilities of an exercise machine transferring to the real world, forget about it. They don't work your stabilizer muscles. They have a limited range of motion on a one-dimensional plane. The translation into real-world strength is minimal at best. And the same thing can be said about a treadmill or a stair climber machine. I used to train on the stair climber machine aggressively before I would go on mountain climbing trips. And I was always disappointed in how ineffective those machines are at preparing you for the real thing. I could do 300 floors on the stair climber at the drop of a hat, usually in about an hour and 10 minutes or so. You would think that that would prepare me for the real thing, but it doesn't. It doesn't prepare you for the lack of oxygen. It doesn't prepare you for all of the stabilizer muscles that you have to use when going up an incline. It doesn't prepare you for the temperature differences or the backpack that you're carrying. So cross-training with too much technology makes your cross-training wholly ineffective. So people who grow up in an environment in which they are unsafe, well, they are disadvantaged in many aspects. And while it's not a life to be glorified, that experience, should the system actually collapse, is going to increase their survivability immensely. Now, I'm not comparing a poor person here to a well-to-do person who has all sorts of preparedness skills and survival training. Obviously, that individual, wealthy or not, is going to have the advantage. If you have actual skill sets which are for the purpose of self-sustainability or emergency preparedness, then clearly you're going to come out the victor no matter how poor and impoverished an existence your competitor has. I'm just talking about people who have no survival skills. If I had to choose between a person who grew up poor and who was trying their darndest to get out of that life, or a person who was entitled and grew up in the suburbs, I would choose the person who grew up poor in a hot second. Now, this doesn't mean that just because you live a prosperous life that you don't have problems. I understand that there's problems that present themselves at every level of the game. But the problems that people have in the suburbs are what we call first world problems. The problems that people have in the hoods of the world are what we call survival problems. Big difference there as it translates into SHTF. There are certain mental faculties which cease to develop in the absence of the problem-solving stimulation that presents itself in living in a precarious environment. And most rich people actually understand this. They understand that if things get too good, you're going to get soft. And that's why many of them have such eccentric pastimes to keep them on the edge. There's a scene in season 9 of The Walking Dead, and this isn't really a spoiler, but Alpha, the leader of the Whisperers, she's a very ruthless leader who frequently will sacrifice or extinguish any of the subordinates who even dare to question her authority in any way, shape, or form. And whenever she feels she's getting soft, whenever she feels she's not hard enough on people or dictatorial enough, she gets one of her lieutenants to whip her so that she can feel pain, to keep her tough when she gets soft. This is a perfect example of what I'm talking about here. Now, I'm not saying you should be some totalitarian, post-collapse, sadistic dictator. I'm just trying to give you another example of what I'm talking about. Hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men. Weak men create hard times, as the saying goes. And once again, hard times create strong men. So if you are a parent, I would strongly encourage you to give your children a bit of freedom so that they can explore the world and make some mistakes. And this is hard for us as preppers because in many ways, we're always trying to control the situation. We're trying to control all of the variables. Preparedness itself is a form of micromanagement. But the moral of the story here is, don't get too soft. Don't get too complacent. And never, ever underestimate somebody just because they don't have the same standard of living as you do. Because in times of crisis, you will be greatly surprised to see who can keep it together and who cannot. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Canadian Prepper out. The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up through CanadianPreparedness.com. We've totally revised our website. We only deal with quality products at the best prices, and all of my subscribers get a VIP discount of 10% off the entire store. Use discount code SURVIVALPREPPER for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive and the prepared thrive. See you next time.